I haven't made a video in a while, and this is going to be very short, but I was listening to yesterday's live stream with on Girl Country with Luke and Paul and Cassidy and Grim and Gavin, I think was there for a bit, Michael Satori. And so it's really interesting because I think, right, that entire conversation, and the irony of this, the content I'm about to make, content, the irony of what I'm about to say is not lost on me at all because I'm making this not in a live stream because I work during those live streams that Luke has in the middle of the day, usually. Um, so while I would love to participate in person, I'm going to do it asynchronously. Um, is right there, there's this kind of this inherent theme through the entire discussion over, I mean, I'm sure everyone picked up the main theme. The main theme was like, you know, can we make content without kind of becoming corrupt or something like that? Or not content. That's sorry. Wow, why is my language going that way? Um, can we? Can someone have a channel and in the corner and not choose the path that leads to problems? Not become corrupt, not make it about Mammon, et cetera, right? But there's a deeper kind of underlying thread, and it came up so many times, and I can't be the only one who noticed this, right? I think, in fact, it was very clear. I think that Cassidy and Paul and probably Teo, like, were actively engaging this line of the thread, but it wasn't. It wasn't really made explicit in the way that I would have liked. So I'm gonna. That's all I'm. The only reason I'm making this video. It's maybe gonna be 5 minutes long. Um, and maybe if I send it to Luke or whatever before today's, he can think about it or something, and it can become part of the conversation. I don't know. Or now that I understand some of the channels on Grizz's stream, because I never really understood the difference between those, I now know where to put things a little bit. Okay, so what's this underlying thread? What's this bigger thread? It's So I'm going to use language that really comes from, Nate, Shari, Jess conversations. That's that corner of this little corner, right? Um, which is around how, you know, framing the idea of one of our primary roles in this world is to be a mediator. Fractally, mediator, us and the world, God, friends, family, neighbors, communities, right? And I'm using mediator not in the way that I came to this corner thinking that word meant, because for Jews, mediation has a lot of its, especially for Orthodox Jews, it tends to have a lot of layers and baggage that are often problematic. But in this much broader sense of just um, basically being in the world to, like, just to help other people be in the world, right? And then you in turn also need that same mediation, right? So because humanity is kind of a horizontally kind of flat in a sense, right? At the social flat level, like, we all help each other in this float, in the version of the flotilla where we're ants and we're all holding onto each other's arms, legs, whatever ants have, so that they can survive the flood, right? Mediating is grabbing onto, or trying to grab onto other people's legs. So yeah, I don't know. So how do we mediate in that sense, in the Jobian sense, right? Job trying to mediate for his family, whether he does a great job mediating for himself when he doesn't want to, right? He keeps asking for someone to come to his aid as like a angelic lawyer before God's court, and then asking, and eventually, God to mediate, his friends failing to mediate, and he himself by the end of the book being the one who has to mediate for his friends with, to God, for what, they're speaking wrongly. And I mean, we can go down the Job path, but Jess and Shari will do a much better job, and I don't want to go on for an hour here. And part of being a mediator, right, is you have something that you think will be helpful to the world. At the same time, and we right, and then we see this a lot, right? I mean, this was Michael Sartori wanting comments, and this was Luke, wanting more comments than views, and there's something at the end he said too around the same idea. The, like, I'm glad that's helpful for people, right? That's something he says a lot. Um, right. So you think you have something that could be helpful for the world, and also that's one part is also stuff that will help you kind of self mediate. So external processing, make these videos, write the script, whatever it is to help you process. Which both Michael and Luke brought up, but I think also that came up in Taylor and Cassidy as artists, right? Wanting to I think that's both for them and for others, right? But that they have this unique artistic contribution to make in this space. But it came up in fractally in the conversation too. Um, and then there's the other side of mediation, which is like actually knowing, not just like, oh, I have this idea that I think would help people, but actually like knowing people well enough to like know individually, personally. Let's go personalist, Luke. Right? Personally, what would help? I need to know where you are at and what level of engagement, what language you speak. Right, this gets, Paul was talking about, hierarchies of language and picking and choose, or Luke also brought this up, right? Choosing language that sometimes makes it hard for like strangers to come into the conversation. Um, but a lot of that language, the reason it was developed, especially like let's say Vervaeke or Peugeot, or Paul, right? They all come up with a number of terms, as does Luke, of course. Is because the current language failed to capture something. And for the people who are already deep enough in the conversation, they can use this new language, which will help them explore the ideas further, right, and deeper, and in ways that have more either nuance or clarity or whatever. Um, so figuring out where to meet your audience out, and that might mean a better camera so that you don't look fuzzy on screen, right? Like that's what Luke says at the end there, right? When Paul says, like, oh, look at, is it less authentic? I have a better camera, and like, but Luke says, I can see you clearer now, and that's the point, right? You have to meet your audience where they need you, and know your audience. Not just an audience, the persons well enough, and sometimes those are like, yes, they'll make everyone easier for everyone to see the person. So like, it's kind of a group effect. Sometimes it really is like, oh, I need to use this language that I know will only I switch sometimes to Hebrew to talk to Jacob because I know like it's not. I mean, it's not necessarily just like, oh, keep this conversation secret, private, whatever. That's right. Part of it often is really just like I don't have a better way to express this idea or communicate it as quickly or as easily, and when we both know everything packed into that Hebrew term. So I can use it as it's a shorthand in a sense, and yes, it's exclusivist in a sense, absolutely, and so is the Greek or Latin terms that Vervaeke uses. Yes, but they act as these internal right ways that we can map each other much better. And part of right, and I think there's this tension, right? Because at some level, there are people, and I don't know if it's just personality stuff. I know Luke will talk about his Enneagram, or however you pronounce it, and other people use other language, but I think there's this deep question of are you making this for yourself? Are you making this with others in mind in a very generic sense? Or are you making this really specifically for, you know, this meaning crisis thing? And I see this specific group within, let's say, this little corner that could really use advice on. Well, Chris is a great wave of obsession, right? It's a great example. This is for the lurkers, right? There are people, if they're lurkers who are like me, that's who I want to help because that's the thing that I'm living out right now. And I think I have particular insight, advice, or even just like empathy for. Um, and we see this, right, with some of the AA stuff with Chad too, right? Like it's not necessarily, right? It's exactly the same thing, right? It's this very kind of focused, specific thing. And I do think that's in some ways, by a lot of Grizz's content, like people have a hard time, like, oh, it's not really content, it's anti-content, it's like meta content, whatever people call it, right? But it's not. It's in some ways it's addressing the entire corner, and not a specific audience within it. No, he has other things, other talks that are very much more specific, D&D and Richard Rollins stuff, and Nate, and like, he's definitely had talks that are more specific, but a lot of it's this very generic stuff. Um, so I think like, there's this like tension, right? There's this tension about, is it for myself? Is it for others? And when I say it's for others, do I really mean it's for an other, right? Are we really being personalist here? And some people, I mean, there are different proclivities there and personalities and different ways people need to process thought, and different types of help, insight, whatever that people want to share with others, right? So right, all that's there. Anyway, this is longer than I intended, but I'm hoping that that language, right? And why am I doing this, right? So really for the people in that conversation yesterday, it may be like one level out from around them, the people who are having this like, what is CLC conversation and how do we make content conversation, or how do we engage, or how do we start channels, or how do we get the lurkers to, do we want all the lurkers to come on? Like, is that a goal? Then maybe that's not the goal, right? And I do think there's a lot of important fears about Mammon and corruption and choosing the Daily Wire path and audience capture. But here's the thing, and this came out really nicely, I think, both in comments that Cassidy and Paul made yesterday. There are really important points. Like, if you just talk and it's just your mom and grandma watching, you're not really talking, you're not really finding your mark with that audience. You're not really getting the engagement that you're looking for, but also like you're not really helping people. I mean, in the sense of, even if you have no self-interest in this and no ego, and you're just like, this is just fun and play, but no one's playing with you because like you're not playing something that's fun or engaging or whatever, that people feel like is worth attending to, then yeah, I mean, that's not necessarily just an ego thing, right? That's also just like you are not really helping, and it's just another kind of, I mean, it's not even a voice in the wilderness. I mean, it's like a tree falling in the forest and no one's hearing. So yeah, audience capture is weird, right? Because you really do want to meet your audience where it's at some level. But at the same time, you don't want them to stay at that level. You think you have something to contribute to help move them. And by audience, I mean individual persons here in some ways, but like you want to be able to help them and influence them and change them and mediate for them, come to their aid, support, show them love, caring, attention, whatever it is. And that's the balance, right? The balance that one's trying to figure out is how much do you cater to an audience, to the YouTube platform company. This came up with the Mr. Beast conversation too, right? Mr. Beast, is he making these videos because it's what his audience wants? Is it what he feels like his audience? They don't even necessarily know that they want it fully, but like he knows that they want something, and he can get something close to that, but he can push them further in a direction that he thinks will be useful, helpful, entertaining, etc. And in some ways, right, like I know where it's very tempting to look at everything, especially capitalistic, as in this very skeptical light, and I know that's Luke and Grimm's like first impulse. But like YouTube came from something that initially wasn't this, right? And part of it, and even movie studios, I mean, you can think about this like any of the big professional productions, right? Like at some level, the non-skeptical version of those stories is, I want to tell a story that entertains audiences, that makes people laugh, makes people think, makes people cry, gives people insights into life, teaches people how to put on makeup so they can look better and make them, whatever. I mean, that's okay too, right? Like it doesn't have to be necessarily like very, like these are all different realms of potential mediating. And yes, finding that balance is really, really hard. But like figuring out where and this is veiling and unveiling, right? And this is, I'll end with this. I know I said that twice already, but the mediator, and this is what Cassidy said about filtering, self-filtering, and also filtering because you have a job and you're a parent and like all those things and your reputation. Like, yeah, like you have, the mediator is someone who has to know how much to expose of themselves, of their message, of their story, how transparent to be, and at the same time know how much to veil. And part of that veiling is for privacy, is security, kind of egoic veiling, but part of it is making space for the other person, because you won't really find out what the other person needs, wants, you could use the mediation for, the help for, the love for, the attention for, whatever it is. You can't hear their story unless you contract yourself and veil enough, right? So the mediator is always doing this balance between veiling and unveiling. And I think there's a part of the thread here is not just the skepticism. And I think if we just go down that route, I think we miss a big part of the differences in what's going on here. And I think it's often hard to, in that conversation, I felt that there was a lot of disconnect around these two sides, the two non-skeptical sides, on how much do we veil and how much do you unveil, even if everything's taken as the non-skeptical, fully generous reading of I'm here for my audience. Like, what is that? Am I here for my audience because I think I just have ideas and I want to get them out in the world because, you know, which is in some ways kind of egoic. I mean, let's be honest, right? Like, I think, oh, I have the solutions to the world's problems. On the other hand, like, we are called upon as mediators to help each other, and like like that's it's not an evil. I mean, it may not ever be pure, but I don't think it's necessarily. We shouldn't automatically write it off as evil. And making a platform isn't necessarily an evil. It can, um, right? It can have plenty of good intentions with it. And of course, there are secondary effects. Cassidy brought this up also, right? That yes, you could have all the best intentions, but just the medium of the platform itself becomes the message, becomes this YouTube algorithm isolating conglomerate thing, that's has its own spirit and comment sections and toxicities and things that happen, and those are secondary effects that we may not usually be able to predict, honestly, right? Those emergent effects that we can't know, but yeah, I mean, figuring out how to mediate better, and how much to veil and how much to unveil. And it's not just broadcast everything all the time, every thought, every moment of your life. Even if you make zero money off of it, like that would not be useful. And it also like it would be bad. Like it would have secondary toxic effects. We know that. And yeah, and there's a lot both to the art of film, but there's also like a lot to the art of mediation and like how like rhetoric and communication theory and persuasion theory and yes marketing and branding. Even like there are versions of that stuff that aren't evil, that actually like how do you tell someone you have a really good product that actually is really good? How do you build trust? And we can talk about like there's this like the authentic versus the profilicity, like, and I can't remember what the third one is, but right there are these things that Paul's been playing with, but they're all important, and they all can be tools used for the good. And well, I'm not saying don't be skeptical. I'm also saying we need to have this conversation on the at the level where we do assume good intentions, so we understand some of these differences. I think because one of the problems I would love to see us discuss more directly is not less the corruption side and more the mediation side. How do you veil and unveil? And that's going to be different for different people, right? It's going to be different for different contexts, different audiences, different, whether it's one person audience or, 500,000 people audience. And there's a lot of accumulated wisdom and knowledge about that stuff. And it would be when we don't really have those voices here so much, often. I think Cassidy might in some ways be an exception. Obviously, people with the bigger platforms have done a better job at that, I would say, automatically. It's almost like know them by their fruits. But there is a point where that isn't true, right? I mean, that's the whole, like the Mr. Beast comments, especially from Grizz, about when that gets beyond, like, he became the best YouTuber, but at what point is that a question of mediation and like doing the best mediating for an audience versus when does that become, something where it's the algorithms are basically just the things making him the most popular, and it's not really about the people anymore. But those feed each other, right? They're not. There's a transactive emergent effect there, so it's not necessarily fully separable. So yeah. Anyway, those are my thoughts.